I think that finding the answer to the origin of COVID would not be as damaging to science and to international relations as failing to find that answer. A more complete understanding of the origins of COVID-19 clearly serves the interest of every person in every nation on this planet. It will limit further recriminations and diminish the likelihood of conflict. It will lead to more effective responses to this pandemic, as well as efforts to anticipate and prevent the next one. Thankfully, it seems more and more scientists are shifting their positions to agree that a laboratory leak hypothesis must be properly investigated at the very least to set a precedent. Despite representing a wide spectrum of opinions on the likelihood of a laboratory leak as the cause of the pandemic, many scientists have united to write open letters calling for a credible and rigorous investigation of both natural and lab-based origin hypotheses. Indeed, the growing calls for an investigation have stimulated renewed conversations around the types of pathogen research being conducted around the world and what scientists can do to make this research safer. How COVID will continue to evolve in terms of deadliness and transmissibility between humans and other animal hosts remains to be seen. But we do know one thing: the virus is here to stay, making any credible knowledge as to its origins all the more critical. Find out more on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
By August, even the Chinese state-controlled media appeared to have given up trying to persuade the world of a natural spillover explanation and started to claim that a laboratory leak was indeed likely. Except critically, the lab leak happened at the University of North Carolina. Remember the Dr. Barrett, North Carolina connection. It's coming back now.
Hold on, wait. I haven't heard of this one, Amir. We've discussed a few things, before this podcast, a little peek behind the curtain. We do discuss a few things, but I don't know anything about this.
Yeah. On August 9th, 2021, Global Times published an article arguing that, and I quote, frequent accidents attributed to lax safety procedures at Dr. Barrett's lab in Chapel Hill, pointing to that location as the likely source of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I quote again, with a mixed record on safety, the U.S.'s ambiguous double standard attitude toward the COVID-19 lab leak theory has led many in the public to become increasingly suspicious. It keeps smearing Chinese labs for leaking the virus while attempting to cover up its domestic situation.
So let me guess, how a leak in North Carolina might have caused a pandemic in China, it did not explain.
It didn't, but I think the Chinese government might be signaling Barrett's prior research with the bat lady in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and perhaps some component of the gain of function research was done by Dr. Barrett at the University of North Carolina because it was BSL-4 protocol done. And the Wuhan Institute of Virology at the time in question, from 2012 to 2018, when they were probably doing the gain of function research, was at most BSL-2, and that's a level of protocol for safety when doing research with viruses. It has since then become a BSL-4, and the Chinese Communist government is big on telling us that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is BSL-4. But please keep in mind, viewers, that it was not a BSL-4 at the time. It was a BSL-2, then it became a BSL-3 and a BSL-4. So something's going on here with the Chinese. It does look like a garbage attack on Dr. Barrett and the University of North Carolina. But remember, he did do research with the bat lady at the time in question. And so there could be some international political signaling to the Chinese government that, hey, you are somewhat complicit in this. Any negligence on our part Maybe you didn't give us the right protocol. Maybe you shouldn't have let us do the research here when we were BSL-2. We should have been BSL-4. Maybe you're BSL-4 at the University of North Carolina and you screwed some of it up. Maybe it's all garbage. I don't know, but this is the kind of stuff an investigation should find out. And this is in our own waters. So this part of the investigation, we could easily find out. So.
No way, man. I mean, what? try to keep my chair like so, like, to be clear, I mean, to me, the attempts by the Chinese government to deflect blame had by now descended into a farce.
It can, on that one with Dr. Barrett, could be farce, might not be. We need to investigate. But, here's a situation where I think it looks like farce, but man, I don't know. But it could be. On August 10th, the Swiss embassy in Beijing took to Twitter to point out that a scientist named Wilson Edwards, supposedly based in Switzerland, widely amplified in Chinese state media since July 24th, when he joined Facebook to post a complaint about the origin tracing of COVID-19 and American pressure on the WHO. The guy simply didn't exist. He didn't exist. So
he didn't exist. Wait, so I assume Wilson Edwards, he just disappeared from Facebook soon afterwards?
He did. And maybe he only existed in the mind of Chinese intelligence agencies, but maybe not. This is why, yet again, it's kind of bizarre, but we don't know. But yeah, he just disappeared.
I mean, it may seem farcical, to us here, in the USA, but in China, anyone who went against, such stories, would be in huge trouble, man. Huge trouble.
Yeah, I mean, any whistleblowers who try to bring light to the nature of COVID-19 as it emerged in Wuhan, they're done for. Two young activists, Chen Mai and Kai Wei, were found guilty by the Chaoyang District People's Court on August 13th, and I quote, for picking quarrels and stirring up trouble. They were sentenced to prison for 1 year and 3 months each, though released for time served. Their crime, creating a repository on the website GitHub of articles that had appeared online in China, in which included reports, interviews, and personal stories about the early weeks of the pandemic in Wuhan. And a citizen journalist, Zhang Zan, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for daring to report on China's government's shortcomings in handling the Wuhan outbreak.
Man, I mean, it just seems, the Communist Party handled the COVID-19 the same way they handle most things in history,
or dissent, quarantine it to death. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that the 3 Wuhan Institute of Virology workers who fell ill in November 2019 were said to have worked in the bat coronavirus laboratory and have symptoms that suggested COVID-19, specifically ground glass opacities in the lungs and a loss of smell.
I mean, even today, it still bothers me. Much of the debate, around COVID-19, its origin, it assumes that the laboratory leak, theory, it has to prove itself. It has to prove itself before we can take it seriously in any regard, which is a little silly to me.
It is, by contract, natural spillover is the default assumption, which does not have to prove anything. This holds any laboratory leak theory to a higher standard of proof than any natural theory. The influential article, Proximal Origin paper, March 2020, by Dr. Christian Anderson and his colleagues took this line, focusing on the lack of evidence for an accident rather than the evidence for natural origin. And while I admit that a furon cleavage site could have arisen naturally, it is highly unlikely and not probable.
Yeah, I remember, I believe it was the Chinese, in China, the World Health Organization joint study, them together, I think it was February 2022, 21, a press conference. I believe it said that, so they did not see the evidence for a leak. They therefore did not need to investigate, any possibility of it, further than that. It just wasn't worth their time.
I mean, it's utterly nonsensical, and I'm being polite.
And Emir, you're not always polite.
No, not when it gets this bad. I mean, millions of people died. Come on.
Yeah, obviously, yes, of course. I guess, why should the burden of proof, be with those who posit a laboratory leak? Why do you think that is?
For starters, to our knowledge, there has been no major pandemic caused by a laboratory leak. So COVID-19 would be a first. But the times have changed radically since we have entered an era where scientists are collecting, sequencing, and manipulating viruses at an unprecedented scale worldwide and engaging institutionally at a global level, gain of function research.
I mean, I've heard of mistakes with viruses before, though.
I know there have already been numerous near misses around the world, given the powerful circumstantial evidence that Wuhan was not a particularly likely place for a natural epidemic of a SARS-like virus from which to originate, but instead it's extremely obvious place for a laboratory leaked one to start, since it has more virology labs than anywhere else in China, and it's their epicenter for the study of viruses. I mean, look, it's reasonable to expect both hypotheses to be put to a similarly rigorous test. That's can't argue.
I hear you. I mean, I just think that even if the burden of proof was on the laboratory leak initially, it's shifted since then. The closest relative of COVID-19, RATG13, it got to Wuhan via scientists shifts. It shifts the burden of the proof in mind, I think.
I mean, mind you, I concur. And I think that the viability of the lab leak theory increases given the obfuscation and misdirection in the story of the Mojang copper miners, which we've gone over maybe ad nauseum. I don't know. But given the existence of the other 8 COVID-19-like viruses from the mine, given the missing database of more than 22,000 entries, given the long record of virus collection, coronavirus genetic engineering, and animal infection experiments in Wuhan in the various virology labs located there, but especially at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the lab leak theory is more credible also given the track record of scientists inserting furin cleavage sites into viruses and the failure to find a furin cleavage site in another SARS-like virus, despite widespread searches in China and other countries. And given the failure of the wet market spillover hypothesis to find any definitive evidence, no intermediate host, no immediate precursor to COVID-19, no animal samples found to be positive for COVID-19 ever anywhere worldwide, not one. These factors may not have proved the laboratory leak hypothesis, but they have very clearly undermined the position of the natural spillover scenario as the default hypothesis. So, I mean, at the end of the day, given the aforementioned, the lab leak theory is standing tall and proud.
All right, that was very eloquent. Monologue, but just to play devil's advocate real quick, like what if one day we discover that COVID-19 originated by natural spillover? Like, what if that actually happens?
I mean, I'll quote someone else to counter. In the words of the journalist Rowan Jacobson, and I quote, "Despite 15 years of coronavirus hunting and testing by the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it was helpless to prevent a pandemic in its own backyard. If that's a coincidence, it's one of the great ironies of history," end quote. And nonetheless, I grant it would be a cruel coincidence if true.
Yeah, maybe one day the origin we found to have been, a farm of COVID-19 infected ferret badgers or a shipment of, traumatized pangolins, those anteaters. See, I learned something, and, that were quickly destroyed, by farmers or smugglers to avoid being blamed for the pandemic. And maybe someday, something at that specific, could be found out. Who knows?
And perhaps it may emerge that the zoonotic origins had in fact been tracked down by Chinese scientists early in the pandemic and covertly destroyed or covered up so that the Chinese government could try and sell us the frozen foods, not from China origins hypothesis. In this case, we would have maligned the very scientists who are working painstakingly to prevent pandemics in Wuhan. But no, look, at the end of the day, if you live in Transylvania, near a big dark castle, and you suddenly hate sunlight and churches and have a craving for blood, it's because you've been bitten by a vampire. The proximity to Dracula is proof enough for the lab leak theory to have evidentiary dominance until proven otherwise, period.
So thanks to the Chinese government handling of COVID-19 to this day, the sparse evidence available demand the natural and laboratory-based origins are both treated as equally likely events.
Look. Even if advocates for an investigation into the laboratory leak hypothesis are eventually found to be wrong, I still think it's imperative that a true investigation from global sources take place for many reasons discussed in this podcast already. The warning about gain-of-function research is massive. The worries about bringing viruses from the field to urban laboratories where accidents do happen, the anxieties about disturbing bats and other wild animal populations in the name of sciences, these are all still valid, even if COVID-19 did emerge without the help of research activities in Wuhan, China.
Yeah, and what if we discover that the COVID-19 originated from a laboratory leak? Like what then? Like what if that actually comes out?
Well, it would have been much easier on scientists, science writers, journalists, and the public if we could be sure that COVID-19 had spilled over into humans free of any laboratory involvement.
Yeah, but if it is proven one day that COVID-19, somehow escaped from a laboratory, science's reputations would suffer, from a huge blow. I would assume, and that explains, the institutional denial worldwide by science, of this, lab leak. To me, that's kind of clear that that's what happened.
I mean, yeah, since research that was previously thought to be life-saving and pandemic preventing would suddenly stand exposed as the very source of a worldwide pandemic is the antithesis of science. So I get your point. The almost 2 decades of research that followed the SARS epidemic in 2002 and 3 failed to keep its promises of preventing the next pandemic and yielding broad spectrum SARS vaccines or therapeutics in time for the COVID-19 outbreak. I mean, the face of science is wrecked, and we alluded to that earlier, with the MIT editor. So
do you think like virologists might find their grants terminated or at the very least diminished, their experiments banned or heavily regulated, what have you, and the reputations, potentially tarnished, after all this?
I mean, grant money would shrink, and money's money, at the end of the day, follow the money, And some might argue that science is generally regulated more tightly and conducted to higher standards outside China. But that will go far, it won't go far, I think, with the general public, especially considering the early vehement denials of the possibility of a laboratory leak by outspoken Western scientists and science journalists. If the lab leak theory holds, it's not just communist China that falls. Western science bootlicking of the initial theory that it was from, snakes on down to a natural spillover, that they posited and clung to for 2 years while the world died and children turned dumb from lockdowns is hellaciously damning. The justified backlash from this will also likely expand to the field of virology to impact other hotly controversial areas in science, which is why Science Worldwide would rather move on, and you've alluded to that. Secretly knowing what it now knows, it seems to hate the light of truth. And so I think without an investigation, it's going to prevent a lot of healing that needs to go on and preclude practical, institutional, remedial work that needs to be done for the next pandemic, because there'll be another one.
Yeah, so like at this point then, I think this, reassessment will happen to some small degree, if laboratory science is fully exonerated. In this case, scientists, politicians, the media, and the public have seen that even if it didn't happen on this occasion, a dangerous virus could one day escape from a laboratory experiment.
Especially when gain-of-function research, is done in labs not qualified for such research as was done in Wuhan. As I said earlier, it was only later raised to a BSL-4 protocol. Experiments to alter viruses and make them potentially more dangerous, to come up with a vaccine anticipating a mutation, even unintentionally, if it goes awry, it needs to be subject to a new round of review and debate. I mean, a whole new assessment of cost-benefit analysis needs to be done after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, although it has been demonstrated again and again, not the least with the near miraculous development of novel infectious vaccines in 2020. We had a few flubs there. That science is vital to the future of humanity. That's important to remember.
I mean, the vaccines that we came up with off the fly, under the pressure, within a year or so, yes, I would concede that. No argument. It's paramount for scientists to play leading roles in the investigation of the origin of the pandemic. No argument. Hence the world's deep and profound disappointment at the way so many scientists close their minds and close ranks, like the Lancet letter we alluded to earlier, against the lab leak hypothesis so prematurely, so early in the pandemic, or at least showed far too little scientific skepticism and scientific curiosity on the issue, when scientific curiosity was exactly what was most needed at the time.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the world would have to negotiate a tougher, more transparent regime for regulating research on pathogens.
And this can't be done without scientists. But now I think it's got to be done alongside non-scientist stakeholders who aren't affected by potential grant money loss, and their reputations are not so at stake. The founding contributions from internet sleuths and outsiders, several were scientists in their own right, to be clear. It can't be denied and should be celebrated, but we need to go forward at an institutional level, and we can't rely on internet sleuths for scientific truths in the next pandemic. I mean, that's just plain crazy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I would agree. It is scientists who must prove capable of credibility and transparently tracking the origins of COVID-19, no matter where that leads us. They have to be the ones to do it.
Yeah, but Levi, in my mind, there's a far more serious implication for scientists and humanity if world governments and organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, from having ignored or dismissed the lab leak hypothesis when it mattered most. I mean, regimes around the world that are carrying out military/civilian dual-use pathogen research, and that would be much of the planet, as well as terrorists who are also considering the use of bioweapons, are paying attention to what happened institutionally at a global level. And not only will they have noticed the vast scale of disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, they will also have noticed how easily the Chinese authorities dismissed a lab leak theory and neutered an international investigation with the willing help of so many alleged scientific experts worldwide and mainstream media, to which we've already alluded.
Yeah, bad actors may have learned that they can easily get away with the creation and release of dangerous pathogens. I'll give you that, with an unpredictably large impact on their target populations. This is true, whether or not a laboratory leak was actually responsible in the case of COVID-19. But we do have, a number of avenues to the truth as to the origins of COVID-19, do we not?
Well, I mean, look, since China's never going to help us on the issue, for which I believe they should be kicked out of the World Trade Organization, I think we have to conduct a systemic and transparent review of the crucial information that exists outside of China. We got to at least start with, what can we know outside of China to which we have access to? What information and data can we get?
All right. What does that look like to you then? Explain that just a little bit.
Well, you got to start with the EcoHealth Alliance with Peter Daszak. You have to start there, The EcoHealth Alliance, proud of having closely collaborated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on the surveillance of bat viruses for many years, must possess some data or correspondence that could be helpful in evaluating the likelihood of a laboratory origin. And assertions such as those by the president of the EcoHealth Alliance, Dr. Daszak, that he had seen the Wuhan Institute of Virology's pathogen database and that it contained no information of relevance, it's just not acceptable in the light of the extreme stakes involved. We do not have to take that man's word for it, and a subpoena and getting that information, whether he likes it or not, and deposing him under penalty of perjury, nothing less. Anything less than that is just ridiculous.
I mean, are there other potential sources we should look into then? I mean,
well, he's the main one, but as late as September 2021, new and potentially concerning information from parties inside the U.S. continue to be released to the public without any sense of urgency. So, for example, at the end of July, the NIH had written a letter in response to a senator revealing that during the time it had funded the EcoHealth Alliance, more chimeric coronavirus work had been proposed, this time involving MERS, a related novel bat coronavirus that went to camels in 2012, to evaluate their behavior and animal infection models at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So The latest clues have indeed emerged outside China. On September 2021, Labor Day in the US, The Intercept published more than 900 pages of freshly released documents describing the NIH funded research proposals and project updates by the Eco Health Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's significant.
Yeah, I think I recall that the Intercept had to litigate to get these documents, which they had requested 1 year before. I think it was under the Freedom of Information Act when that was all.
That's right. Of course,
yeah.
Eco Health didn't give it up easily, for reasons, obvious reasons. They have not been scientific, credible, or transparent. Eco Health Alliance has been the opposite of engaging in scientific investigation and transparency, the opposite. But the contents would undoubtedly have alarmed the public if released in early 2020. But by September 2021, many of the key pieces of information had already been, scavenged by internet sleuths and scientists, carefully poring over the dozens of research publications by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The documents confirm that the work on SARS-like coronaviruses has been conducted at BSL-2 and BSL-3 level protocols, which we've alluded to earlier in the podcast, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had at their fingertips a wide variety of boutique cell lines obtained from bats, primates, humans, and other animals, which were used for the isolation and study of novel viruses that other virology laboratories do not possess. So they did it there. That they had purposefully sampled thousands of animals and human beings in rural China and in live animal markets that they expected to be at high risk of exposure to SARS-like viruses, that there were protocols for sampling bats, civets, raccoons, dogs, and other potential intermediate hosts of SARS-like coronaviruses, with a focus on avoiding being bitten by the animals while collecting samples, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology brought these samples from spillover hotspots in southern China, places where wildlife trade, hunting, and bat guano collection is common. They brought it back to Wuhan for in-depth study in the attempted isolation or synthesis of novel viruses. The scientists there acknowledged that field work involves the highest risk of exposure to SARS and other COVID viruses while working in caves with high bat density overhead, and the potential for fecal dust to be inhaled. There is also some risk of exposure to pathogens or physical injury while handling bats, civets, rodents, or other animals, their blood samples, or their excreta. One important revelation was that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had kept records of people who tested positive for signs of infection by animal viruses, and also tracked research-related incidents such as being bitten by bats or market animals. So we can start with, does Eco Health Alliance have access to these medical records and data on animal bites suffered by researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And is any government going to give a damn and find out, like the US government? Why don't they help?
Only one government seems to have that kind of power in there right now, and that current administration doesn't really seem too motivated, to answer that question.
Motivated, it's not even a topic of discussion. It's not even a topic of discussion by this administration. So, in addition, the documents showed that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had shared with their US collaborators that by mid-2018, they had obtained results from testing chimeric SARS-like coronaviruses in humanized mice at BSL-3, potentially on the Wuhan University campus instead of at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In one case, a chimeric SARS-like virus not previously disclosed was found to replicate more efficiently by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude in the lungs of humanized mice than the non-chimeric version of the virus, and without causing observable weight loss, which is a way to gauge the severity of disease in mice. Other chimeric SARS-like viruses were also shown to grow much better in humanized mice lungs compared to non-chimeric viruses, while retaining the ability to sicken the mice, causing up to 20% body weight loss by the 6th day post-infection.
All right, so there's a lot of information there. So, I guess, what is the key significance of these particular findings?
Okay, these preliminary findings from 2018, they speak to how unpredictable the results of generating chimeric viruses can be. It's dangerous. You're not in control. It gets out of hand. It can go anywhere.
Okay.
You might get a virus that is less deadly, but more transmissible. Or you might get a virus that is both more deadly and more transmissible. I mean, you're playing with nuclear reactor fire here. It's unclear if more humanized mouse experiments had been conducted after these striking findings, and if other naturally isolated or chimeric SARS-like viruses had been tested in this animal model, perhaps later in civets. To make things worse, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they're known to have conducted classified research, and it has an institutional policy on protecting the confidentiality of work relating to state secrets and research secrets. So because of that, anything that goes awry, the Chinese government can immediately lock down and say it's confidential, precluding the Wuhan Institute of Virology, even if they wanted to, from exposing any mishaps or acts of negligence that occurred if it involved a state secret. And obviously, a worldwide pandemic starting in China, the Chinese government would view as a state secret.
I mean, so like, in other words, like the Wuhan Institute of Virology seems to work hand in hand with the People's Liberation Army.
It does. They're with the CDC in the same city. And obviously, it's all connected to the Chinese Communist Party. But it's not just China. To be fair, another relevant research proposal by Dr. Peter Daszak, yet again, of the EcoHealth Alliance, requesting $14.2 million in funding, and was submitted in March 2018 to the U.S. Department of Defense's R&D agency, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as DARPA. Its subcontractors included, here we go, Dr. Ralph Barrick from North Carolina, Linfa Wang, and Shi Zhengli. We referred to Dr. Shi Zhengli before. The application was ultimately unsuccessful, but its contents laid bare their extensive roadmap for collecting and experimenting with SARS-like viruses with pandemic potential. One of the criticisms of the proposal by the DARPA program manager was that, although the approach potentially involved gain-of-function research, it did, and I quote, not mention or assess potential risks of gain-of-function research and dual-use research of concern.
I mean, basically, it laid out for me, like, what did this proposal involve?
The proposal was to test the spillover potential of viruses that it described as, and I quote, a clear and present danger to our military and to global health security, using a range of infection experiments, including in captive bats in the lab, humanized mice, and batonized mice, that is, mice with bat immune cells. The early 2018 document described plans for a point that Dr. Daszak had denied in 2020, namely that wild-caught Rhinophilus bats were to be kept and experimented with at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Further, it was revealed that by that time, the EcoHealth Alliance and its collaborators had already found more than 180 unique SARS-like viruses across approximately 10,000 samples.
So basically, COVID-19, these bats, were kept in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
I mean, it seems so. Most importantly, the proposal contained the first written statements by the EcoHealth Alliance that it and its collaborators had plans to insert cleavage sites into engineered SARS-CoV viruses, new coronaviruses. And I quote, we will analyze all SARS-CoV viruses gene sequences for appropriately conserved proteolytic cleavage sites in S2 and for the presence of potential furin cleavage sites. We will introduce appropriate human-specific cleavage sites and evaluate growth potential in viro, monkey kidneys, and human airway cultures. Worse still, if functional cleavage sites were discovered in rare SARS-like viruses detected in their sequencing data, they plan to introduce these into new virus strains in the lab. In other words, this early 2018 proposal told us that the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology were in possession of a growing semi-private collection of SARS-like viruses. They had intended to expand their recombinant virus infection experiments across a range of cells and animals. They had also delineated a workflow for identifying novel cleavage sites and inserting these into novel spikes and novel SARS-like viruses in the lab.
Wait, this is, I mean, I'm jumping the gun. This seems circumstantially damning. Like, why didn't Dr. Fauci ever mention any of this? Or wasn't this mentioned at all by anybody?
Mention it. Dr. Fauci denied and stonewalled this from the get-go, something I think Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky will hopefully soon resolve.
Right. So what is the relationship then with Dr. Zhengli Shi, if I said that correctly? What's that doctor's relationship? The Bat Lady. That's who it is. Who essentially, ran the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the United States. What's the relationship there?
Well, we've already referred to her research with Dr. Barrick, and here they are, Dr. Barrick of North Carolina and the Bat Lady doing this grant with Echo Health, $14 million, which was denied, but it almost looked like they were trying to create COVID-19 in a lab, for God's sake. So even though the grant was denied, it doesn't mean the work wasn't done, but her work back to the United States, straight up, her work was funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID acronym, and a part of the U.S. National Institute of Health, NIH.
Yeah, so since the grant proposals that funded her work are a matter of public record, did they specify exactly what she planned to do with this money?
Yes, the grants were assigned to the prime contractor, yet again, Dr. Daszak, yet again of the Echo Health Alliance, who subcontracted them to Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady.
Is that the same Dr. Daszak who wrote the letter, in the Lancet that we referred to way back, seems like forever ago in the podcast?
Yes, it is. And here are extracts from the grants for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. Now, keep in mind, COV stands for coronavirus, and S protein refers to the virus's spike protein. And I quote, test predictions of COVID interspecies transmission, predictive models of host range emergence potential will be tested experimentally using reverse genetics, pseudovirus and receptor binding assays, and virus infection experiments across a range of cell cultures from different species and humanized mice. We will use S protein sequence data, infectious clone technology, in vitro and in vivo infection experiments, and analysis of receptor binding to test the hypothesis that divergent thresholds in S protein sequences predict spillover potential.
All right. In non-technical terms, slow it down for me a little bit. What does this mean exactly?
It means the Bat Lady set out to create novel coronaviruses with the highest potential infectivity for human cells. Her plan was to take genes that coded for spike proteins possessing a variety of measured affinities for human cells, ranging from high to low. She would insert these spike genes one by one into the backbone of a number of viral genomes, reverse genetics, and infectious clone technology, creating a series of chimeric viruses. These chimeric viruses would then be tested for their ability to attack human cell cultures in vitro and humanized mice, and this information would help predict the likelihood of spillover, the jump from coronavirus from bats to people with no intermediary host, no civet, no aardvark, no anteater, no pangolin, no nothing, no snake, nothing.
All right, point blank, I got to know this. Did Dr. Shi generate COVID-19? Point blank.
It cannot be stated conclusively that Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady, did or did not generate COVID-19 in her lab because her records have been sealed by the communist Chinese. But it seems she was certainly on the right track to have done so. I would now like to quote Richard H. Ebright, a molecular biologist at Rutgers University and a leading expert in biosafety. It is clear that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was systemically constructing novel chimeric coronaviruses and was assessing their ability to infect human cells and human ACE2 expressing mice. It is also clear that depending on the constant genomic context chosen for analysis, this work could have produced COVID-19 or a proximal progenitor of COVID-19. Note, genomic context refers to the particular viral backbone used as the test bed for the spike protein.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that, as we are wrapping things up here, that the lab escape scenario for the origin of COVID-19 virus, that specific scenario, as should by now be evident, given what we've discussed, is not mere, hand waving in the direction of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's not, we're not just going to look over there, it could be this. No, it is a detailed proposal based on a specific project being funded by the, what was it again? What was the organization? The NIAID.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. There's a basis to this. It's not just something that's kind of just being said for the sake of being said.
Which is why the scientific community and certain Western governments all have dirty hands in this, not just Communist China, and would, accountability, they're going to avoid accountability in this regard at all costs, in my opinion. Lots of future grant money here is at stake. Let's be clear on a key motive here, and that's why they're doing the ostrich and the sand maneuver, in my opinion, to a large degree. Yeah,
but despite such a stark conclusion, I mean, I hope it's been relatively clear that our preference, throughout this podcast was for a balanced, argument, a balanced discussion, that led to the truth, not for a victory for one side over the other. We're here just presenting evidence that we have found. We want to bring it to the forefront. That's what we're just kind of doing here.
Yes, but the fact is, the world now faces the strong possibility that scientific research intended to avert a pandemic instead started one. That all that collecting of viruses and sampling of bats in remote caves and then hiding the specimens in secret databases had put all of humanity in harm's way.
Yeah.
That 2 decades of research on the genomes of SARS-CoV viruses had not produced a vaccine, but instead an epic plague, COVID-19, and that from the start, there had been an active campaign by Chinese scientists and government officials, aided and abetted by far too many scientists, scientific journal editors, and journalists, mainstream media in the West, to prevent the world from finding out just what the hell happened.
Yeah, I mean, and if another pandemic of, mysterious or ambiguous origin occurs, in the next decade or so, unless we learn from key lessons now from this pandemic, we'll just make the same mistakes. That's just bound to happen.
I mean, so far the world shows little sign yet of either finally shutting down the wildlife trade or addressing the risk of the burgeoning pathogen research worldwide, let alone both. There's little progress, if any, of governments designing a better system to encourage whistleblowing or transparency in science, public health, global pathogen surveillance, better security on gain-of-function research, none of it.
Yeah, or rather the reverse, honest discussions among leaders and scientists, had been threadbare, I think.
Worse than threadbare, they were making fun of anyone who went against them, belittling and humiliating them globally. So, sadly, that's where we are. And you heard it here on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist. In February 1975, a group of scientists gathered near a beach in California at Asilomar near Monterey. They agreed to establish voluntary guidelines to ensure that recombinant DNA technology would be used safely worldwide. They agreed to draw up safe containment procedures in the laboratory, to limit the experiments to strains of bacteria that were unable to live outside the laboratory, and to avoid working on highly pathogenic organisms. Designed to reassure the public that science was being transparent, the conference set the tone of the debate for decades to come. For almost 50 years thereafter, biotechnology was indeed reassuringly safe, but it has long since abandoned the cautious limits set at Asilomar. As this podcast has documented, pathogenic viruses have indeed been the subject of frequent recombination or engineering experiments, gain of function. As the COVID-19 pandemic ends, a new Asilomar conference is needed, vitally needed, to globally regulate specifically gain of function. Even if we never discover the origins of COVID-19 exactly, engaging in the process of investigation will have yielded life-saving outcomes if the world adopts new policies and mitigation strategies to prevent outbreaks that result from natural spillovers or laboratory accidents. Actions must be taken to prevent laboratory-based outbreaks and regulate high-risk pathogen research. We desperately need a new international moratorium and biosecurity treaty focused on pathogen research. Otherwise, we are all at risk of another COVID-19 breaking out through a laboratory spillover. We end this podcast with a tribute to those who made this change possible, especially the sleuths of Drastic, who labored away for many months, mostly unrewarded with anything other than ridicule and insult from mainstream media. They dug deeper and crawled through darker holes than any scientist into subterranean hoards of data and searched for nuggets of truth about what happened in Wuhan and Yunnan in the years before 2020. People like the Seeker, Rosanna Secreto, Francisco de Ribera, Yuri Dagan, Charles Small, Brian Reed, Billy Bosticson, Monali Rahalkar, Gillis Damanouf, Moreno Koliakovo, and Barbel Elephant. Hopefully I didn't butcher the names too bad. I apologize. As well as many others whose contributions will remain nameless. Twitter was their only forum. Had they not persevered in their own time and at their own expense when all the well-funded forces of science, journalism, business, and politics took little, if any, interest in the origins of COVID-19, we might never have had the chance to find out as much truth as we currently have. And to not dig further is a devastating insult to the millions who lost their lives to the terrible pandemic of COVID-19. We also pay our respects to the whistleblowers in China who first sounded the alarm and hastened the global release of information regarding the novel outbreak in Wuhan. Some of them gave their lives and well-being to do so and are heroes in the truest sense of the word. The impact of their bravery cannot be overstated. How many of us would willingly jeopardize our safety and that of our loved ones to tell the world what truth we did know in this matter? The fate of the investigation into the origin of the pandemic still depends on these courageous souls, these whistleblowers in communist China. There's hope that some of the few people there who hold the pieces of the puzzle within China's borders will one day, even if decades later, be able to illuminate the story of how COVID-19 found its way into Wuhan from Yunnan province. We have seen time and again that the truth often comes out many years later. Hopefully, we will not have to wait that long. You heard it here on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist.